All right. Yeah, welcome everybody. So this is our third meeting in the RL mini series. We started 2 weeks ago with Dave's presentation of the three dogmas of RL, and then last week Mani Hamidi built on those dogmas through the lens of evolution. And now we're back with Dave to present a work that is, I think, directly building on those on some of those dogmas. So. Welcome back, Dave, and please take it away. I think you're muted.
There we are. Perfect. Just
Yeah.
trying to unmute. Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Hadi. I had such fun the last 2 weeks, both in the Three Dogmas discussion with everyone and in the follow-up chat last week. And yeah, thrilled to be back. So thanks so much, Hadi, for putting this series on. It's been a lot of fun and for having me and for everyone for being here. So today I'm going to talk about this work on plasticity and empowerment. This is joint with a variety of wonderful collaborators. This was a really fun project with these folks, and it's really the product of this collaboration. This is one of those projects where we had lots of discussions and disagreements for a long period of time until we had some agreements. And so it was that period of kicking up dust until we finally agreed on some things. And so yeah, I feel grateful to my colleagues for working with me on this. This was a lot of fun. So our starting point for this work, really building in part on some of the places we left with the three dogmas, was to ask this question of what exactly are the essential properties of an agent? And what I mean by this is maybe by reference to other areas of science we have a clear picture of what the kind of elemental properties are that we might be interested in studying or asking questions about or factoring into our hypotheses and theories. So, for instance, in something like a free body diagram, we might ask questions about this box that's going to slide down this ramp. And in asking questions and answering questions, we can use things like the height of the ramp or the force due to gravity or friction. And these can factor into the sorts of questions like how long will it take for the box to reach the bottom of the ramp? What speed will it be reaching when it gets to the bottom? And so on. And by analogy, when it comes to thinking about the concepts of, say, an agent or an organism, one of our main starting points is the suggestion that we don't have that same set of sort of elemental properties figured out. So, at least within kind of computational reinforcement learning, one natural strategy is to invoke a variety of different environments that can bring out interesting characteristics of agents. So, of course, the this is the arcade learning environment was a hugely popular test bed for quite a while within reinforcement learning, and it allowed us to focus on, say, places where certain kinds of learning algorithms were incapable of making progress in some tasks as a way to conclude that maybe we had reached a saturation point in terms of a particular kind of quality. So, for instance, sort of common folklore for a little while to use, say, Montezuma's Revenge as a problem to study long horizon planning, challenging sparse reward exploration problems, and these sorts of things. And of course, a lot of this gets grounded out in learning curves. So we often look at performance of various kinds as a mechanism on those tasks, such as Montezuma's Revenge, for determining can the agent explore effectively if it's good at solving certain kinds of exploration tasks. Good in the sense of its learning curve has the desired sort of structure to it. And there's this really lovely effort led by Ian Osmond called the B Suite, the Behavior Suite, in which they took this a step further to really give a deeper look at a variety of different characteristics of agents. So they broke it into this radial plot here using one dimension of exploration, one of credit assignment, one of scale, noise, memory, and so on. And what was going on under the hood is that you would look at something like credit assignment and give the agent a variety of different credit assignment problems like say this umbrella task where the agent has to decide whether to take an umbrella and then later it either rains or doesn't rain and the agent has to determine that it was its umbrella related action that led to the experience of getting wet during the rain. And similarly for exploration, we can cook up a variety of bandit problems or things like deep sea and combination locks to test whether agents can explore. But again, these are ultimately symptoms. These are, if an agent can explore effectively, it should be able to solve the kinds of tasks that we think feature hard exploration problems. And really, what we're after is trying to figure out what are the inherent properties of the agents themselves? And conceptually, do we have a clear picture of what those properties are? So, one way I like to start this is by saying if we look out in the natural world, certain objects we might identify have a clear set of characteristics that we might be interested in order to make predictions or form theories or hypotheses about those objects. So, say something like inanimate matter, like this rock, we might say its mass or its energy might be some of the most useful properties to know about this in order to, say, form meaningful predictions. But when trying to understand animate matter, something like biological organisms like this caterpillar here, the question I would float to all of you is what are the analogs of, say, mass and energy? What are these kind of elemental characteristics that we should be looking at that can factor into kind of far-reaching explanations, theories, and hypotheses? And I'm not going to suggest that we have a complete exhaustive list of such elemental properties, but I do want to propose that plasticity and empowerment should factor into that menu of elemental properties of agents. So what exactly are plasticity and empowerment? I imagine many folks in this audience are well familiar. And I know of read papers of folks that have studied both of these that are in the call. But I will give us a quick overview of both of these characteristics. So empowerment refers to the caterpillar's ability to influence its observable world. So it's a measure of how many different things can the agent do based on its actions. So as an example, the caterpillar can eat a flower, it can eat a leaf, it can transform into a butterfly, and then further change the world in other interesting ways. It can fly over a little river, it can fly into a tree, and so on. And the running definition of empowerment we'll work with comes from Klayubin and colleagues from 2005, and they define empowerment as how much control or influence an agent has. Now, where this will end up is as defining empowerment as a function that assigns a number to input-output systems. So things that interact with the world. We can imagine a rock is interacting through, say, forces, and a caterpillar is, well, also interacting through forces, but perhaps through action and observation. And where we'd like to end up with this function of empowerment is to reach the conclusion that rocks are less empowered than caterpillars. The total magnitude of things caterpillars can do is greater than that of a rock. Now, plasticity refers to the organism's ability to adapt to its experience, how malleable the organism is. So, in the case of the caterpillar, we can ask if it were to observe, say, a predator like a bird, what might it do in response to seeing that predator? Or if it were to see, say, a fire, what might it do in response? Does it have the capability to change either its beliefs, its knowledge, or its behavior, or perhaps its values according to these experiences? And the original definition of plasticity comes from William James in the 1800s and refers to the degree of yield of a structure. So a highly plastic system is one that can yield greatly, and a not very plastic system is one uh, that cannot yield. Now, over the course of the kind of 130 or so years since James's book, there have been, I would say, at least two kinds of plasticity emerge within this broader definition. So I'll just want to linger on this distinction for a moment. The first is more of a behavioral perspective, and as to my knowledge, this is really more used by the biologists that consider plasticity. So, for instance, Wheeler in this book about the ant behavior refers to plasticity as the power of an organism to adapt its action. So, how much can, say, this bird change what it does in response to its observation, but what it does in terms of how it acts? What does it choose to do? By contrast, the more cognitive and neuroscience side embraces a perspective that refers primarily to what happens to the mind of the organism. So, for instance, in Citri and Malenka, they define Synaptic plasticity or neural plasticity is the capacity of the neural activity generated by an experience to modify neural circuit function. So this distinction is that in the one case, we're referring to plasticity where experience modifies the agent's mind, maybe its beliefs, maybe its parameters, its neural circuitry, and in the other case, how much the experience modifies the organism's behavior. And of course, these two things are related. You would imagine most salient changes to an organism's mind will probably have a downstream change to the behavior. And in order to change behavior, the organism probably needed to change something about its mind as well. But these two have a subtlety in how we end up formalizing them. So I just want to pause and point out this distinction. One of the most canonical definitions of plasticity from within the machine learning community comes from Carpenter and Grossberg, where they define it as a capacity to remain adaptive. So that's sort of the running natural language definition that we'll use for plasticity. And just like with empowerment, where we'd like to end up is to define a function that takes as input, again, an input-output system, say a rock or a caterpillar, and assigns a number to that system such that we can compare, is a rock more plastic than a caterpillar? And the main framing that we propose is to actually treat plasticity and empowerment as mirroring concepts. So empowerment, as I mentioned, the formalism predates us. This comes from the Klayuban paper I mentioned. We'll get into the formalism in a moment. And the definition of empowerment refers to how much an organism's actions can influence later observations. So this is this notion of empowerment. And our proposal is to define plasticity as the amount of influence that observations exert on an organism's action. So this is taking a behavioral view of plasticity. There's a way to recover something more like a cognitive view, which we'll come to just near the end. But for the most part, we're going to stick with this behavioral view, in part because it makes the mirror directly more apparent. But there are some interesting relationships between this behavioral and cognitive perspective to discuss later on. So plasticity we can think about as this capacity to adapt, and empowerment, this capacity to control. And we think that these two concepts are best understood in terms of these two influences. So this creates a push-pull relationship between agent and environment. And the more the agent pushes, the more the environment has to pull, and so on. So using this framing, we're going to present a formalism of plasticity and empowerment, but empowerment again is largely coming from Klayuban. And this will build to our main result, which shows that every agent in every environment will face something like a dilemma between its plasticity and its empowerment. So the way this will look is a simplex of this kind, where on the x-axis we visualize the agent's plasticity, and the y-axis we visualize the agent's empowerment. And what we'll prove is that there is in fact an upper bound on the sum of these two quantities. So while an agent can maximize its plasticity entirely, and it can maximize its empowerment entirely, there is a region of unrealizable plasticity empowerment pairs. So an agent can't simultaneously maximize plasticity and empowerment. So we'll dig into that result a little bit more when we unpack the formalism, but that's really the main result that we'll build up to. To get some intuition for this, we can imagine, say, a group of musicians jamming together. So we have a piano player, a guitar player, and a violin player, and we'll take the egocentric perspective of the violin player, and they are playing music with this guitar player and piano player. So in this case, the actions are the notes from the violin, and the observations are the notes from the piano and the guitar. And empowerment in this context is how much the violin's notes influence their companions. Plasticity, how much is the violin player listening to and influenced by the piano and the guitar? And what the tension suggests is that either if the violin player is fully controlling what the guitar and piano player are doing, it leaves no room for the violin player to be surprised by what their companions play and thus be influenced in return. There's only so much sort of new information to go around. So we think of there as being this sort of beautiful sweet spot for things like music and art and collaboration and dance, where all of the companions are both contributing something, they're influencing, they're their friends, but also being influenced at the same time. So in the language of this simplex, this just means that there is this upper bound that all agents must respect. So throughout the talk, we'll just build up to stating this results in full thorny detail. So the big claims of the work, just to summarize before we dive into some more technical details. The first is to treat plasticity and empowerment. We really think of these as sort of elemental properties of agency. There was some speculation in the project about whether there's a definition of agency that's plausible just in terms of plasticity and empowerment. I'm happy to return to that speculation near the end. But we do think these are kind of two core elements of agency. The second key piece is that we'll develop a formalism for thinking about plasticity and empowerment using the language of directed information. So it's a slight twist on mutual information that we'll come to shortly. And then using this formalism of directed information, we state this main result of this tension between plasticity and empowerment. That might be a good place to pause, just see if there are any questions or challenges so far. What do we think? Okay, no worries. I'm happy to move on. I will say, oh yeah, Eli, go for it.
Okay, so I guess if you're asking for questions now, I'll give this now instead of later. How would you say that plasticity tends to trade off with something like homeostasis? Just
Mm.
preservation of the agent as such? Or is this as, or are these results outside of the embodied setting where the agent can be, fundamentally reconstituted by the environment?
Great question. I have a few thoughts on this, but nothing conclusive. So at the moment, you're right that our language, our framing of an agent and environment interacting is purely through the exchange of information. So we won't require anything like a body for the agent. Now, this notion of homeostasis might imply something about the relative balance between plasticity and empowerment. So I had a few conversations with people following this work about, say, the relationship to free energy and how the sort of y equals x line along the simplex here might suggest something interesting that an agent is perfectly balancing its plasticity and its empowerment. I want to think about it more, to be honest. It's a nice question. My hunch would be there are ways to cook up at least abstract, maybe theoretical examples in which there are agents that have achieved homeostasis, but we can put them at almost any point along the plasticity empowerment
Okay, that
trade-off.
that would be really interesting to show. And, just to say what brought this on, like the
Mm,
picture of the caterpillar really makes you think about homeostasis because, the thing about the caterpillar is that most of its agency is basically expended. I mean, in a real life, what I mean is that most of its agency is basically expended on safety.
mm,
Like it needs to not be stepped on, it needs to not be snatched up and eaten by a bird. And like being eaten by a bird is not plasticity, even though it changes the information content of the internals of the body by
mhm.
destroying that information content. Like a nervous system
Right.
engages in plasticity in order to aid behavior that keeps the rest of the body alive.
Mm. Interesting. My hunch would be a lot depends on the specifics of the environment. So in the case of the caterpillar and the bird, if the bird is actively pursuing the caterpillar, then we it requires something about the caterpillar's plasticity and empowerment in order to retain that level of safety, because it needs to be able to respond appropriately to when the bird is making its move. Whereas maybe a safer environment the caterpillar may not need any degree of plasticity nor empowerment. But it's a good question. Let's hang on to this one. I want to keep thinking about this throughout the talk as well. And yeah, any other questions before we press forward?
I have a question, but I know that it's
Mm.
a longer discussion. I just want to highlight it, right? So the two components of agency, plasticity and empowerment, leaves something important out. It's the notion of internal model, which allows you to predict
Mm.
and anticipate things. And in the violin example, you said, notes are no longer surprising to you. And the notion of surprise comes from having predictions and then being able to predict perfectly. So I guess to me, that seemed like, after reading the paper, that seemed like the biggest missing piece, that cognitive
Mm.
element. But you mentioned that you're going to talk about that, so I'll just wait until that part.
Yeah, no, thanks, Hadi. That's a great question. I would say plasticity and empowerment are intended to be pieces of the picture, but maybe not a comprehensive picture of agency or the properties of an agent. So I would say things like the internal model will be implicit rather than explicit for us, as well as goals. So we actually won't talk too much about goals and intention in the context of plasticity and empowerment. We have a few thoughts on this. I have a couple of slides just at the end. We can pick that discussion back up, but it's a really nice point. Um, and I can see how that could also potentially relate with Eli's point about homeostasis, that it's probably having a good model is probably needed for achieving homeostasis, right?
I just dropped a paper in the chat that I want to highlight. I mean, if I have an
Mm,
internal model that is predictive of your future physiological needs, that's not homeostasis and allostasis. And
mm,
Eli's one of his PhD advisors, Lisa Feldman, has this paper from last year where they're basically claiming that brains are not for thinking. It's actually mostly just allostasis, and thinking is just a side effect. Like, so I guess it's, if you want to just think about
mm.
biological agency, then Eli's point becomes even more central. But, maybe we're thinking about agency in the way that applies for like biological and artificial agents. So I guess in that sense,
Mm.
maybe it may not be that central, but just so you know, like from the biological side, it's one of the core central elements.
Very cool. Yeah, thanks, Hadi. Yeah, I'll definitely check that work out. That sounds great.
All right.
All right, so I'll press forward into some of the formalism, but please, along the way, if any questions come up, feel free to just dive in. I'm very happy to take questions and discussion along the way. So this will, for those that were at the Three Dogmas talk, this is going to be just a restatement of our agent definition without rewards and goals. So we're really trying to embrace this kind of minimal picture of an input-output system. So we start with an agent as a thing that can take an input we call an observation and can emit outputs we call actions. And of course, if we wanted to be really careful, there's probably more to dig into here to really figure out what exactly are observations, what exactly are actions. We'll grant ourselves that for now and take this as our starting point. So as I mentioned in the Three Dogmas talk, this is roughly what Sutton calls the buttons and lights view, in which the mind, the agent, is isolated behind this interface of the input bits, the lights, and then the output bits, the buttons. And as mentioned, goals are effectively absent from this story. So if we were telling the traditional reinforcement learning story, of course, we'd have alongside that observation, we'd have a reward signal, which we discussed quite a lot the last couple of weeks. For now, we're going to punt on the reward signal entirely. There are some ways we can slip it back in and talk about both plasticity and empowerment alongside reward, but it will not be core to our story. So I'm leaving it out for now. So this gives us a view of agents as starting from what we call the interface, which is a set of actions A, a set of observations O. These give us the set histories, H, which is just a sequence of experiences. So a sequence of button presses followed by lights, followed by buttons, and so on. So of any length. And our agent is going to be a function from one of those histories, or really any of those histories, to a distribution over actions. So I'm using delta here to denote the simplex over the set A. And likewise, our environment is going to be a history-based environment. So it's effectively an infinite state POMDP, but we're just not going to write down the state space. We're just going to write this down as sort of the aperture that the agent views the environment through. So given any sequence of experience so far and the agent's last action, the environment will sample an observation from this distribution over observations. And then this induces a stochastic process of lambda and E exchanging A and O back and forth indefinitely. And just a quick note on this environment family. So this comes largely from this work by Marcus Hutter, who's been fleshing out this sort of universal AI picture for quite some time. And in some of his work, he's proven an equivalence between this and infinite state POM-DPs. So if you'd like, feel free to think about this as a POM-DP. We're just, again, choosing not to write the state space down. We'll use this large lambda to refer to a set of agents. And again, these are effectively policies, but we really want to embrace the picture that we're treating agents as our kind of central object focus. So we choose to define these as agents rather than policies. So lambda will just be any set of agents. And then lastly, we'll use the notation of A1 to n to refer to the sequence of discrete random variables of the action that occurred at time step 1, then the action that occurred at time step 2, all the way out to n. Okay, any questions about the notation? Perfect. Okay, so this gives us this minimal picture of an agent and an environment interacting, again, just by exchanging action and observation back and forth and inducing this stochastic process of A1, O1, A2, O2. We define it here as though the actions and observations are exchanged one after the other. But this is, again, mostly just for notational convenience. We can imagine that maybe the agent gets to emit many actions before observing and vice versa. So now in the language of empowerment, coming back to Clauben's definition, we can now basically replace this empowerment function. At the very least, we can replace the rock and the caterpillar with the lambdas, the input-output systems that define that rock and that caterpillar. So given an interface that characterizes what count as inputs to the rock, what count as outputs, what count as inputs to the caterpillar, what count as outputs, we can now start to fill in some of the details of this function. And again, this is largely coming from this Clauben paper. So we'll define this concretely using what we'll call the K empowerment. So K for Clauben et al. This is the empowerment of an agent in a specific environment. And it's going to come out to effectively the mutual information of the sequence of n actions that the agent plays with the observation that occurs directly after those action plays. So we're asking, how much do these n actions inform the nth observation that occurs after those n actions? So this is roughly asking, to what extent do the actions inform the observation? And in the original Clauben paper, they choose to define this in terms of a channel capacity. So they take a max over the set of open loop control policies. So here I'm choosing to express this as the probability mass function of sequences of n actions. So these are not allowed to be reactive policies. It's just what PMF would you place over the next n actions? And the empowerment is the max over this quantity. So in this sense, it's really a property of the embodiment in a way, the morphology of the organism, given that particular interface, given all policies that could be played, what's the max possible mutual information between this sequence of actions and this observation. And the way I like to think about empowerment, there's really two ways in which choice enter the picture. So since we're dealing with agents causing things in its environment, we're going to deal with a lot of the complexity and challenge that comes with trying to define choice and really free will. And one way that these mutual information-like definitions get at choice is through this max. So if the agent were to play a different policy, how would it impact the outcomes in the environment? The other way that choice enters the picture is through the randomness inherent in the stochastic process. So we'll unpack that a little bit more later. But the last thing to note is that this definition is again relative to this particular choice of policies that are being maxed over. And the original Clauben definition was relative to this choice of the open loop control policies that just choose a PMF over the next n actions. So the difficulty here is that the chosen policy set are effectively just these open loop controllers. So it doesn't allow for interactivity along the way. And so in some follow-up work, in the thesis by Captiboy in 2011, they proposed to enrich this definition by making one change, which is to move away from the max over this set of policies, which also brings in this concept of directed information. So we'll now just spend a little bit of time introducing directed information. It's a really beautiful concept. I didn't know it prior to really doing this research, and I've come to really appreciate what it brings to the table in terms of kind of its conceptual power and its modeling power. And the story of directed information is to really start from Shannon's setup. So we imagine again, we have Alice sending a message to Bob through some noisy channel. So this discrete random variable X. And Bob's goal, of course, is to reconstruct this message X after the noisy channel. And Shannon's main theorem uses this channel capacity, the mutual information between the X that was sent and the reconstructed X, as a way to characterize the max amount of information that can be shared between Alice and Bob. Now, in the 70s, Marco pointed out that this is a one-directional channel, but we could imagine an extension in which Bob actually gets to send Alice a message back after receiving XT. So we'll simplify this picture a little bit, but keep in mind there are some noisy channels in the mix here. So Alice is now sending a message X to Bob, and then Bob gets to write back a message Y. And then Alice, on hearing Bob's message, gets to send back yet another message to Bob, and so on. And this process can repeat indefinitely. And so the main sleight of hand that's going on with this work to get at plasticity and empowerment is we are going to treat the process of an agent and environment interaction as effectively a bidirectional communication channel. One of the reasons that that bidirectional communication is so interesting is that there are then two kinds of information. So the first is, how much does the message that Alice sent to Bob influence Bob's next message? So that's the directed information X to Y. And the second, how much do Bob's messages influence Alice? That's the directed information Y to X. And we can extend this to sequences of random variables as well. So how much information did the sequence 1 to n influence the sequence Y to n? And again, these are just the random variables that were emitted over time 1, 2, 3, and so on. And this picture gives us a definition from Massey in the 90s called directed information. I'll put the equation up, but it's very similar in spirit to applying the chain rule of mutual information. So what we're looking at is, how much information did this set of n messages X end up informing this set of messages Y? And let's unpack this a little bit. So we have a sum over these time steps of from I equals 1 up to n. The idea is if we take messages x1 to n and y1 to n, we're asking, say at I equals 1, how much did x1 influence y1? And the conditioning, when I equals 1, the yi to I minus 1 just drops out. When I equals 2, we're asking, how much information did x1 and x2 send to y2, given that we already know y1, and so on. So we're constantly asking, how much does x inform later y's? And by convention, we'll assume that yi comes after xi, but there's ways to handle all sorts of little variations that you might like. So in general, we'll represent directed information using this kind of visual of x influencing y in this way. And the really beautiful result to me about directed information comes from Massey and Massey in the 2000s. And what they proved was that the total information exchanged between, say, Alice and Bob is just exactly equal to the two kinds of directed information summed together. So they called this the conservation law of directed information. So the way this looks, we talked about these two kinds of information, and what their theorem shows is that the total information of the system is just exactly equal to how much did Bob influence Alice and how much did Alice influence Bob. So this theorem is a way of decomposing the influence into these two sides. Eli.
So those are two different arrow symbols there,
Yes.
from Bob to Alice and Alice to Bob. Why are they different arrow symbols?
Yes, you have a keen eye. So good question. The hook arrow is accounting for fence post issues, basically. So one signal has to be sent first. And so we're just there's an off by one error, basically. And the hook arrow
Okay.
is a way of dealing with the off by one error. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, any other questions here? Perfect. Okay,
I'm
so
actually, I
oh
took
yeah.
me forever to unmute. Sorry, I kept getting into your editing tools, so I hope I didn't draw on your slide as I was trying to unmute. Anyway,
Mhm.
so I lost track. Is the reverse direction from Bob to Ella? That's a noisy channel as well.
Exactly. Yes.
And does it have the same kind of noise, or does that matter? Like what? Um,
That's a great question. Does that matter? I'm gonna say I'm uncertain about that. I would suspect asymmetries in the kind of noisy channel could, it wouldn't break this result to my knowledge, but I want to be careful about that. But it could change other aspects of the setup. But my honest take, but I'll color all this by saying I have some uncertainty about this. If there are significant asymmetries in the noise, it could change some subtleties about what's to come. But I don't think so. There's a possibility. So I just want to flag that uncertainty.
and thanks. I'm also so when you showed your initial setup when you introduced information theory, you had a slide that it looks very familiar. You've got your X going to the right, you got your noise, and then you had something else, and I forgot the symbols, and then we switched to these X's and Y's, and I'm just forgetting. So the mutual information between um, your X, all your X's and all your Y's as you're drawing in this equation, is that what I would think of as the mutual information between um, the thing that Alice sent and what Bob received? But it doesn't seem like it because Y is going the other way. So I'm forgetting. You want to just show that first slide again before you added the? It just went by too fast for me.
Maybe this one.
Okay. So X and X hat. So if I want to know what the so in Shannon's setup, when we say what's the mutual information, it's between X and X hat.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
typically you have
Yeah.
an
Okay. Yes,
encoder and
that's
decoder. Yeah.
yes. Good. So channel capacity, I know what that is. I think I understand that equation. Good. So those Y's, so the information you've got between the X's and the Y's, that is plain old Shannon mutual information, but it's just not mutual information between two things that normally occur in the usual one-way sort of channel picture.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I guess
Exactly. Yeah.
I'll ask one more thing, which was
Yeah.
so this was done in the 70s, right? And then isn't it the case am I thinking of the right thing that oh who wrote that information theory book? Oh, darn it.
Cover and Thomas, maybe?
No, that's a good guess, but I'm thinking of
Hmm.
somebody who passed away sadly like a decade ago now. British guy. What is his name? Darn it. Anyway, who he had exhumed all this stuff from the 70s in terms of satellite communication, and it turned out
Mm.
that when you get feedback from satellites, isn't this the same sort of theory that was used to improve for increasing baud rates when communicating with satellites? Uh, I'm wasting time. I should let you go on, but anyway, this is something I don't know about, but I'm glad you're talking about it. So keep talking.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Michael. I'm not familiar with the satellite work, but if you do happen to think of that reference, please feel free to share. I would be curious to take a look because I've been curious about this whole landscape, to be honest. It feels quite, parts of it are still quite new to me, and I find it really fascinating. Okay, I think we were about here. Good. Okay, any other questions on directed information? Maybe just a final comment here. One intuitive way to think about directed information is as a slightly causal notion. So to what extent does X cause Y? It's not quite as strong as that. The closest notion of causality you get from here is a connection to Granger causality. But there are intuitive connections. So when we come back to empowerment, we had previously said the one of the difficulties here that Captipoy points out is that this max only allows for open loop controllers, open loop agents. And so in Captipoy's thesis in 2011, they just propose let's embrace the directed information, which then allows us to wash out some issues about kind of communication along the way, because we're only talking about how much do actions influence observations. So we can then replace this max with an arbitrary set of controllers. And again, this is really about the entire morphology of the agent, given this interface, given these actuators and percepts. How much empowerment does this agent have? We'll define this as the C empowerment for Captipoy. So we now have this property that this controller set can be arbitrary. However, one limitation of the directed information is that it's only well defined for equal length sequences of random variables. So in order to enrich this notion, we have one final twist, which is to allow this notion of directed information to apply over arbitrary intervals of time, so that we don't always have to ask, say, what is the empowerment over an agent's entire lifetime? We might just want to know for one slice of time. So for that, we introduce what we call the generalized directed information. And the spirit of this, we'll call the GDI, is rather than x's influencing y's from 1 to n, we'll just allow ourselves to choose intervals a to b and c to d that lets us isolate windows of x and of y, and then we can still ask questions about the influence from those x's to those y's. And we can shift these intervals around. They can be partially overlapping. They can be not overlapping at all. And what we'd like is that the GDI is still recovering a reasonable notion of directed information. So a lot of the technical work here was about how do we define a proper generalization of directed information that allows us to get away with shifting these intervals. And the definition is going to look quite similar, but now our sequences of random variables are defined relative to these intervals of a to b and c to d. And we'll denote this again with the arrow notation, but we'll subscript x with the a to b interval and y with the c to d interval. It's again a sum, just walking along these conditional mutual information terms, but we just need to include the max and the min and now d instead of n, and we have some conditioning that's slightly different. So we'll unpack this a little bit, but the details of the definition aren't so crucial. It's just a way of accommodating these changing intervals. I'll first highlight some properties of the GDI just to build a sense that this is a sane way to generalize the directed information. So the first fact is that if you set your intervals a to b and c to d to be exactly 1 to n and 1 to n, you recover the directed information, as you'd expect. So if this wasn't true, then I think we should just refuse that this is a proper extension of directed information. So the second property we call the temporal consistency, which again, it's mostly just a sanity check that if a to b comes completely after c to d, so we're asking how much do these future x's influence these past y's, this quantity better be 0. And in fact, it is. The next property, and probably the most important one, was to generalize this conservation law. So what we wanted to be true was that, again, if we stuck in 1 to n and 1 to n for both of our intervals, we fully recover the original conservation law. But we also want to recover what happens if these intervals are much later in time. How can we still, to what extent does something like a conservation law still hold? And it turns out it does. One thing that looks a little different here, so you notice on the right-hand side, we have the total information between a to b and c to d, but we're now conditioning on everything that comes before the two intervals. So there's two reasons for this, two ways to think about this. The first is if we set a equal to 1 and c equal to 1, then these two terms drop out, and we just recover the directed information. So we're again just talking about, but now it's one to D and one, or one to B and one to D. The second is it's a way of removing confounders. So we can imagine that at time step one, there was, say, an X that's going to fully determine everything that happens during A to B and C to D. So for instance, if X1 is a blue light, then all future X's are blue and all future Y's are blue. Um, if we looked just from A to B and C to D and we said, well, look, they're both blue all the time. There's so much shared mutual information. What this conditioning does is say, well, in fact, it's because X1 was blue. That's really the reason that these two are blue. So we're kind of removing the influence of what comes before. So now using this GDI, all we're going to do is revisit Captain-Puey's definition and just replace these sequences from 1 to n with sequences from A to B. And then we recover a notion of empowerment. And so we still inherit this arbitrary agent set property from Captain-Puey, but now we can also apply this quantity over arbitrary intervals. And then we show that if you vary different aspects of the definition, so you can vary your choice of big lambda, you can vary your choice of A, B, and C, D, then you just fully recover either the Captain-Puey definition or the Clauben definition. Another distinction that Captain-Puey raises in their thesis that I quite like is the difference between what they call the potential empowerment and the actual empowerment. And they refer to this max as a potential empowerment, whereas the actual empowerment of a single agent represented by a single history-based policy is just dropping the max effectively. And so this is really when I think about the single agent notion of empowerment, this is really what I think of, in the sense that the max is suggesting something about again, the actuators and the perceptual faculties of the organism. Whereas this is given this is how this agent's actually going to behave, here's how much its actions influence future observations. So we will largely work with this notion of empowerment of a single agent. We'll abbreviate this to just E of lambda, but there is in fact an environment present here too, right? The stochastic process of that induces these random variables A and O is really coming from both lambda and E. Okay, so that was a long.
So sorry,
Oh
before
yeah,
you move
question.
on,
Go for it.
can
Yeah,
you
for
help
sure.
us, can you help us understand the landscape of possible definitions for empowerment? It seems like there's two main
Hmm.
ones, the C and K ones, and then you're strictly generalizing both of them. Is that how we should think about this?
Oh, that's a great question. At the very least, for the K and C definitions, I want to say that the GDI lets you kind of vary between them. It just exposes those axes of variation where you can specialize to either. But maybe it's worth pointing out that there's just a whole nother category qualitatively of empowerment definition that's more based in like a strictly causal language. And I think it's an open question to what extent the GDI is capturing the similar kinds of things you might get from a strictly causal language. But I would say in the language of information,
Mhm.
I am not familiar with any other empowerment definitions that really go far beyond what the GDI is doing. I think the main two I'm familiar with are the captive Boy and Clauben, and I think this is intended to try to capture both of them. Again, you can of course choose the potential version with the max or the single agent version, and that's another axis. But yeah, it's a really good question though, Hadi.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
Can
you.
I ask a question too?
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
Thanks, David, for the great talk. I have a question about the definition of directed information. Probably it's too late for asking that question, but I was wondering, would it hurt the definition and the rest of the math if you define the directed information as the mutual information between yi and xi condition on all the y's, in the sense that the agents basically is just using the information of the latest message, in the sense that it, like, let's say that if Alice has already sent it a couple of messages, it has already used all of that information in the previous messages, so it's just
Hmm.
looking at the only the latest message. Probably that would hurt the conservation of mutual information formula, but I was just wondering conceptually, does that even make sense?
Oh, interesting. I like that. So Right. There's something sort of special about the latest observation in a way, and
Mm,
especially in, say,
yeah.
like Markov settings, we might
Yeah.
imagine it's maybe especially critical. So is the suggestion that with directed information, we might look at, say, how much does A subscript A to B influence just one observation as one example?
Uh, yeah. Or how actually, when you're looking at empowerment, it would be that how my latest action changed my current observation given the all
Uh,
the previous observations.
I see. Right. So that would look like, I think we can get away with that by setting A and B equal to each other, and then C and D equal to each other, and maybe one greater than A. So we'd be asking, how much did AT influence OT plus one, or something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think you can still get away with it, but there's probably some subtleties that I'm not fully seeing at the moment. So as an example, let me take us back to the GDI definition. So in here, we are conditioning on everything that comes before. So if we set A equal to B and C equal to D, and it was just a single time step, then the sum would just be a single conditional mutual information term of what information is shared between the current, say, action and the next observation conditioned on everything that came before, which I think is what you're looking for.
Mm, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. So I think the GDI can help us. Um,
Mm.
but there is something special about Markov, so we should let's hang on to this thread as we unpack things. Definitely. Cool. Thanks, Masa.
Thank you.
Um, okay, any other questions? Perfect. Okay, so we promised at the beginning we would end up with this function emp that can take as input some input-output system, whether a rock or caterpillar. And now I claim we have a proposal for that function. We call this thing E. It has these two lambdas, lambda rock and lambda caterpillar. And in principle, if we had full observability, we knew exactly what the interface was for lambda rock and lambda caterpillar, we could go off and measure these quantities and answer this question. Is the empowerment of the rock less than the empowerment of the caterpillar? But I haven't yet said anything about plasticity. So I also promised that we would have a definition of plasticity that can take as input these two quantities. And I suggested that maybe we would be thinking about this in terms of this mirroring property, this mirroring nature between these two quantities. So let's have a look at that. So empowerment, as we saw, is this function that measures the influence from these actions A to B to O, C to D. The agent um, can also be influenced in the very same way by its observations. And that's the spirit of plasticity. So we define plasticity just using, again, the same notation from the Clauben work, this little math frac P. How much do the observations from some interval, A to B, influence the agent's actions over some interval, C to D? And we can again use the GDI to measure influence. And our proposal is that this is capturing this notion of the capacity to adapt. So can an agent change its actions in response to its observations? So let's just think through a couple little examples. So if, for instance, the agent were to ignore its observations and just act, so it's just going to emit, it's going to pre-commit to some sequence of actions. So no matter how the observations change, the action sequence is the same. This quantity is zero. And I'd claim that's what we should expect to find, that the agent has no capacity to change its action based on what it observes. Whereas an agent with high plasticity is one that, depending on how the observation sequence changes, the agent's action sequence will change a lot. That to us is capturing the spirit of plasticity. Again, this is the kind of actualized plasticity. In the paper, we also propose a version of the potential plasticity, where you max over environments, which is to say, if the agent is in, say, a really information-rich setting, it's in a library or a museum or something of this sort, maybe the agent is really plastic in that setting, but in other settings, maybe it's not very adaptive. the potential plasticity we take as the max over this environment set. But again, for our purposes, we're largely focused on this single agent, single environment case. So with plasticity and empowerment, I mentioned at the beginning, we like to think about them as sort of elemental properties of agents. And on my view, I like to think about them as ways of capturing necessary properties, necessary conditions for control and for learning. So we talked last 2 weeks ago about possible definitions of adaptivity, and as promised, this is a very murky, complex territory. I think getting down to bedrocks to define things very precisely is always, of course, a I think generational problem. Like it takes generations to sort things out in most cases. Although at the moment I am quite fond of this definition of plasticity as again a necessary condition for learning. That is to say, if an agent's plasticity over all intervals was zero, then my claim is on at least a behavioral view of learning that no learning is present. This again is ensuring that we're aligning the behavioral notion of plasticity with a behavioral notion of learning. So there's more to say there about, say, theory formation or learning, say, a new language. Even if you don't end up speaking the language, that's not going to be reflected in this notion of plasticity. Okay, so with that, I think we're now in a position to talk about this main results of the work, about this dilemma between plasticity and power. So I mentioned at the beginning that there's this unrealizable region of plasticity and empowerment. And what this tells us is that there's something like a dilemma between an agent's plasticity and its power. And I say something like a dilemma because, of course, the agent can move around the simplex freely. We can have agents that live in the top left, in the middle, in the bottom right, and the bottom left. And there's no sense in which plasticity has to come at the expense of empowerment until it reaches the upper bound on the simplex, at which point, if the agent wants to, say, increase its plasticity, it can only do so at the expense of empowerment. So in that sense, there's a dilemma. So I'll just put the full statement of the theorem up for us for a moment to dig into a couple of the details. So the first thing to note is that this holds for all choices of intervals A, B, and C, D, and any pair lambda E. So this lambda E have to share an interface. No worries. Thanks, Masa. Thanks for stopping by. So given any intervals and any agent environment pair, we define this quantity M, which is effectively an upper bound on the total information that could be exchanged between agent and environment during these intervals. So it's either it's this min on the B minus A interval over the size of the observation space, or it's a min on the D minus C interval on the size of the action space. And what we get is that the empowerment plus the plasticity can be at most this quantity M. So that's this upper bound we see in this simplex. Now, a couple things to point out. So maybe the most crucial is that the subscripts of the E and the P are swapped. So when we're talking about empowerment, it's how much did the agent's actions influence the observations? And when we're talking about plasticity, it has to be those very two same intervals. So the same sequence of actions and the same sequence of observations. So this leaves open the question, well, what happens if the intervals change? What happens over the course of the agent's lifetime? So we'll definitely come back to this point. There's a lot to dig into there. But I just want to highlight the theorem only holds when those two intervals align. So we'll take a quick look at some very simple experiments. So here we have a two-armed Bernoulli bandit, and on the x-axis, we're varying the exploration parameter of a Q-learning agent. So it has an epsilon from 0 to 1, and it just has an epsilon greedy policy. So when epsilon is 0, it's fully greedy. When epsilon is 1, it's fully random. And on the y-axis, we're showing an estimate of the agent's plasticity based on some rollouts. So it's just a little Monte Carlo estimator. And just to build some intuition, the thing we see is that the plasticity of the agent decreases as you vary epsilon. And the reason is that this epsilon is effectively a knob that controls how much of the agent's greedy policy, which is really where its observations can influence it, are allowed to shine through in its actions. And then, of course, when epsilon is 1, we see the plasticity is 0 because the agent is completely ignoring its observations, and all it's doing is acting randomly. Um, the second experiment we ran, these are both very small scale, again, two-armed Bernoulli bandit. So this is all just in a little collab and with a single CPU, basically. We look at the value function initialization, varying from -1 on the left to 1 on the right. So the agent is highly pessimistic on the left and optimistic on the right. And again, we're looking at the estimate of this GDI quantity for plasticity in blue, so the one at the bottom, and then empowerment in orange, and then P plus E in green, the sum of the two. And what we see is that the empowerment actually increases quite noticeably as the agent goes from being pessimistic to being optimistic. And our reasoning for this is that optimistic agents in bandits are ones that create more different experiences, whereas a pessimistic agent is one that sticks to the same thing. So it does, in fact, it exerts less influence over the environment because it's not causing as many things to happen. The agent is sort of staying in one place. The other thing that we found interesting about this is just how much higher the empowerment was in general than the plasticity in this experiment, at least. So how much more information, how much more the agent is influencing the environment than the agent being influenced by the environment.
David, can
Yeah.
can you go back to just the one about exploration? Am I getting it
Yes.
right that it's saying that there's actually a trade-off where more plasticity is related to less exploration? That seems sort of unintuitive.
Mm.
I mean, one question I was going to ask is how is this trade-off related to the explore exploit trade-off? But it sounds like you're thinking it's kind of the opposite here, or am I just not getting this right?
Yeah, so at least in this case, so yeah, great question. I would say in general there is a connection between the two. And in fact, when we started unpacking this tension, we thought, is this just exactly explore
Yeah,
exploit under
yeah.
a different name? Um, and I I do think they come apart a little bit, but they are of course quite related. So one way in which they're related is that plasticity empowerment is about a particular window of time.
Hmm.
But to be an effective explorer, I think requires empowerment.
Hmm.
But to respond to the information in the right way requires plasticity.
Hmm.
And so plasticity empowerment, I think, is more about this temporal profile that ensures explore exploit is kind of handled in the right way. So in this case, for instance, the immediate plasticity of acting according to a high epsilon is 0 because the agent is not influenced by its past at all. It's just acting randomly.
Mm.
But if we were to then stretch out the the experiment and ask, well, what happens now that it's used that data that it generated during the window we see in this experiment? We'd expect the agent that explored well would probably then have higher plasticity later on.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of this because you're thinking about exploration just being stochastic here. I mean, presumably part of,
Exactly.
yeah, okay. So you're thinking about exploration is just how much are you behaving randomly without regard to other information.
That's right. That's right. Whereas something more directed, so an
Right,
agent that's systematically exploring to the frontier of its knowledge in the world or something,
right.
that would require plasticity because its
Yeah,
knowledge of the world is coming from its previous experience.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Allison. Cool. Yeah, any other questions here?
Yes, I'm just thinking about, fixed policy. What is this empowerment or plasticity of a fixed policy? Because in information
Hmm.
sense, probably zero, right? Because uh, if a policy is fixed or versus adaptive, because fixed policies don't create new information, right? In statistical sense,
Hmm.
fixed mappings.
Yeah, nice question. So it depends on a couple subtleties. So if we mean a fixed, like stationary policy, like a Markov policy, then absolutely it will have zero plasticity. So um, there's still some further subtleties because if the policy is allowed to be a function of inputs, so coming back to Massa's question from before, if it's a Markov policy, because we've chosen to focus on the channel from observation to action, the policy is still potentially adapting depending on that last input. Now, the most extreme case we can imagine is a policy that always emits the same action, no matter what. So that definitely has zero plasticity, and this measure will pick up that it has zero plasticity. But the action-based version of this will actually say a Markov policy that changes its action based on observation will have some plasticity compared to the policy that just emits the same action indefinitely. Now, I mentioned at the beginning this distinction between this more behavioral view of plasticity and a more cognitive. There's something like a middle point, which is actually the one we worked with most of the project, which is about imagining that an agent plays a policy each time step rather than plays an action. So this is much more like, say, supervised learning, where the learner plays a classifier each time step. And plasticity is zero when it chooses the same classifier indefinitely, no matter what. But it can have some plasticity when it changes that classifier. So on that view, a fixed policy, an agent that plays the same policy every time step, will have zero plasticity. So there's some wiggle room that allows you to choose between what is the object within the agent that's being influenced. Is it action? Is it policy? Or is it something else, which I'll come to in a moment. Yeah. Does that help, Alec?
Yes, yes. I just been thinking about maybe there's something like epiplexity, recent development where computationally constrained agent have to change. So you extract structure that is available. You could extract if you have enough capacity to extract it computationally, and that kind of creates adaptation. Some connection, I can formulate it, but it feels maybe there is something there.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed that paper so far. I'm still digging through it, but I can feel there's a deep connection here. And I think the notion of boundedness, we haven't really talked about so far in this talk, but the notion of boundedness will have implications for both plasticity and empowerment. So I imagine, as you say, there's likely to be some deep connections between epiplexity and what's going on here. Yeah, thanks, Alec. Okay, so I'll just spend some time and bubble up and think about some kind of implications and open questions before we can go into some discussion. So one of the main things that we thought about throughout this was to think about sort of human robot teams or kind of collaborative settings where you have mixtures of say a person and an AI system of some kind interacting, and we can think about the same music example. One thing that we felt was somewhat potentially interesting to draw out from this view was that given this upper bound on the plasticity and empowerment sum, one thing that turns out to be true is because we're effectively treating agent and environment as this two-player communication, we can effectively swap.
Is it on my end or
We just lost you.
Yeah,
oh
it
yeah.
froze.
Yeah, I just lost
Froze for
David
me
too.
too.
Okay.
Yeah, so did I.
Oh,
Wait, was it Dave or me? I don't know. We lost you, Dave, for 10 seconds, or I lost you. I don't know
It,
what
it
happened.
was on
okay.
Dave's end.
Oh, okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So the premise is that given we've treated agent and environment as in this two-player communication, there's not anything really making the environment different from the agent yet. What we've effectively described is a two-player communication game. And what this means is that the agent's plasticity is the environment's empowerment, or in this case, the person's plasticity is the robot's empowerment, and vice versa. And so what this gives us is a tool for thinking about the windows of realizable plasticity empowerment pairs together. So if I told you that um, there's a window of realizable plasticity values for a given agent, it means for a given person, it means there's a realizable window of empowerment. A lower bound on plasticity for the person gives us an upper bound on the empowerment of the robot, and vice versa. So this gives us a way to reason about the sort of Goldilocks zone or this kind of realizable values of both plasticity and empowerment in a two-player interaction.
Mm.
And so if we can modulate, so one thing that people have, a thread I've really liked in this empowerment literature I've heard folks talking about recently is looking for ways to ensure that in collaborative settings, autonomous systems are systematically empowering people rather than disempowering them. And so I'm hopeful that there's ways to use this kind of language to ensure we're not systematically disempowering people by systematically injecting plasticity into these autonomous systems so that they're suitably malleable and allow people to be kind of empowered in the right way. So what this partially requires is ways to more directly modulate, say, plasticity and empowerment. So I don't think we quite have the right sort of algorithmic knobs yet, but I'm optimistic we might be able to design them to give us more control over, say, how plastic or how empowered are the artificial systems that we're designing. Another thread I've been quite curious about, we don't have any results on this, but I've just found this compelling, is to think about sort of revisiting things like social dilemmas, or even just collaborative and cooperative settings where, say, you have a mixture of people and robots working together on some project. Say you tell this group to build a house. So I would claim if we got to know something about the plasticity and empowerment and nothing else of each of the individuals in this group. So for instance, if we said all of the members of this group have effectively zero plasticity, my claim is we can make a prediction about the quality of the house that results from their teamwork. And that's the kind of prediction that I wanted to, start the talk with, to say, how can we make predictions about um, complex systems effectively? In this case, a highly collaborative setting with involving many different complex subsystems of robots and people interacting. And these abstractions of plasticity and empowerment feel powerful for unlocking those kinds of predictions, potentially. So the other thread I mentioned early on was to perhaps think of plasticity and empowerment as maybe necessary conditions for agency. So my kind of preferred way of thinking about agency at the moment, just off the back of this project, is to say, if we start with an input-output system, then it has to have both plasticity and empowerment in order to be an agent. That's not to say that's sufficient, but if it's lacking either property, we can safely say that it's not an agent. If it's not capable of adapting or influencing the world in some way, then it's not agentic. I think there's still some pieces missing. So of course, as promised, goals do not appear at all, except to say that goals don't appear. And all we've talked about is the ability to alter and be altered. So there's this really lovely, it's a chapter of a book from Philip Ball on agents as organisms of evolution, in which he says an agent is more than just alter its environment; they alter with intent, right? And of course, we haven't captured intent here at all. We've just captured this notion of influence. And so in a maybe classical picture, we might extend the signals emitted by the environment to also capture something like reward. And then we can talk about plasticity in terms of an agent's sensitivity to that reward. It's maybe one way of thinking about incorporating reward. I don't think it's the only way, but it's at least one simple way to do it. We could alternatively just imagine that reward is an element of the observation. So maybe the observation is a big vector, and the last element of the vector is the reward signal. A final thread I've been curious about is this distinction between, say, knowledge and behavior. So we talked previously about how certain notions of plasticity focus on, say, the ability for neural circuitry to rewire, so things more like synaptic plasticity. And I think there's potentially a way to account for this using the same language of GDI, which is how much do the observations influence this object we'll call the agent state, which is just some
Mhm.
way of capturing the contents inside the agent. So maybe it's parameters if it's a
Mhm.
neural net, maybe it's memories if it has, say, episodic memory, um, things of that sort. Could be it's the policy parameters, whatever it might be. And this feels like a potentially compelling way to capture plasticity of this more cognitive or knowledge focused kind. I think there's loads to do to flesh that out and really try to tell us a story of how it then connects to this behavioral view. Where do they come apart? Where do they agree? I don't have answers to those yet, but I find those questions to be important and interesting. So loads of open questions here. Optimistic about this kind of safety and multi-agent perspective that can bring on board, maybe revisit classical notions within game theory, social dilemmas, assistance games. Um, and as mentioned, I think goals and reward missing within the discussions in the group, it was one of these that I'd say maybe every meeting or maybe every other meeting, we would say, do we need to bring on reward? Do we need to bring on goals? And there were some disagreements. And then ultimately, of course, you see how things played out. But it's still one of these threads that we feel, I just feel this draw. We have to flesh it out. It feels important in order to really tell this full story. Okay, so I'll just do a quick bit of wrap up and we can just open it up for more discussion. So we started by asking if mass and energy and these sorts of things are the kind of elemental properties that we might attribute to inanimate matter. Perhaps plasticity and empowerment can be well thought of as the right kinds of elemental properties, at least two of them, for things like animate matter, like biological organisms and artificial agents. And we ended up defining these two properties, empowerment coming largely from Clauben et al. And Kaptopoi, with just this little twist of embracing this GDI-based definition that asks, how much do actions influence future observations? Which then lets us define plasticity also using this GDI, which asks, how much do observations influence actions? So the mirror is that they're the exact same notion of influence with just the direction of influence reversed. And again, this all comes about basically by using this little sleight of hand to treat agent and environment as in a bidirectional communication channel, according to Marco. So using this, we then articulate this plasticity and empowerment tension. So the sum of an agent's plasticity and empowerment at any given time has to be upper bounded in a way that prevents this red region from being realized. Maybe a final point on a slide I could have added, but didn't add. Another area I've been curious about is coming back to maybe parts of Allison's question too about exploration, is what needs to be true of an agent's plasticity and empowerment over time, so throughout the lifetime of the agent.
Mm.
So we're here focusing on kind of a finite horizon version of just looking at one window, but you can imagine, I've had this picture in my head since NeurIPS. Some folks asked me this, and I can't get this image out of my head of something like a cosine and a sine wave, kind of one chasing the other's tail, where they kind of indefinitely oscillate. And that's how I tend to think about plasticity and empowerment as this kind of virtuous cycle where it's useful to be empowered to then find the right information and then be highly plastic to that information and vice versa. And so one way I think about this is any agent's lifetime, we can think about as a point kind of carving its way through this space. So there's something like a geometry of the plasticity and empowerment of an agent over time. And I'm just curious, like what needs to be true of that geometry? What do optimal agents look like? What do bounded agents look like? What do agents that are really effective at exploration look like in terms of their kind of profile of how they carve up this space? So it's another direction I've been quite curious about. So there's a link to the paper in the slides if folks are curious. It's the same title as the talk. I'll again express just a huge thank you to all my collaborators. So Mike Bowling is at Alberta and everyone else is from DeepMind. It was a really fun group and yeah, really grateful we had a chance to work on this together. And with that, I'll just wrap up and go to some discussion. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
All
Dave,
right,
this
go
is
ahead.
this is so great. I love this, and I think there's a million interesting things to say about it. But I wanted to start by thinking about the last point that you made about thinking about how these things might play out over a lifetime. And one of the things that we know is that you get this very, very, very general biological phenomenon, which is having high plasticity, as it were, and low control early on, and then having more control and less plasticity later. And you just see that,
Mm.
it's across an incredibly wide range of different biological agents. You see this pattern, and of course, with human kids, it's particularly dramatic when you have these long periods of immaturity. And as you also know, that developmental pattern is associated with high rates of learning, large brains, intelligence broadly construed. So one question is how you think, what you were suggesting at the end was something more like this alternation between plasticity and empowerment.
Mm.
And I think it's interesting that in fact, biologically, what you get is this pattern where you start out with high plasticity and low empowerment, and then you get greater empowerment and less plasticity. The second question, which is also
Mm.
speaking to the same issue when you were talking about the multi-agent case, if you think about caregiving, so this is one of the things that I've been working on, trying to get a formal computational account of caregiving, which you'll be amazed to hear is completely missing from for some strange, mysterious reason, is completely missing from formal cognitive science and political science and economics. One way that you could think about it is think about an agent that is attempting to maximize the empowerment of another agent, right? That's
Mm.
essentially what a caregiver is doing. So what a caregiver might be doing sometimes is trying to maximize the reward for the other agent, but I think that's not actually what caregivers are really doing. What caregivers are really doing is trying to figure out a way that over a long period of time you can maximize the empowerment of
Mm.
the agent. And that there's something I think that's really interesting about this uh, kind of complementarity between having these highly plastic agents, but then early in development, but then they depend on a caregiver. But it isn't just that they depend on the caregiver to keep them alive. The caregiver also seems to have this function of giving them a wider range of potential
Mm.
potential actions when they become the adult organism. The caregivers seem to be doing both of those things. And then the last thing is, suppose you think about empowerment gain instead of empowerment. And it seems to me like, Adoina and I have talked about this. If you're thinking again about the kids, what they're really trying to do is not maximize empowerment. That's the sort of, deterministic casino state where you're just in a deterministic loop. What they're trying to do is keep getting empowerment gains. So as soon as they figure out how to use the busy box, then the busy box is boring, and they go and find something else that they can
Mm.
go and find something else that they can play with. Anyway, sorry, that's a lot, but this is fascinating stuff, and there's great to say about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Allison. Yeah, these are all amazing threads. Let's see. So for the first one regarding, I love this point about this kind of biological phenomena that we tend to start with high plasticity, low empowerment, and there's just maybe a gradual shift
Yeah,
until suddenly high empowerment and low plasticity. And I can say I really resonate with the point, and maybe there's a chance for this kind of theory to offer some kind of explanation
yeah,
um, at the level of this of something like this simplex.
yeah,
But beyond that, I'm not sure I have an immediate thought about what that could look like, but I really like the thread. And I'd be curious if it's related to this notion of caregiving, right? That
yeah,
um, I'm not familiar enough with the biological literature, but I would wonder if across maybe different kinds of caregiving relationships within different organisms, if there's a change in the that plasticity empowerment
right,
trade-off. Because the presence of the caregiver, as you say, it's if the caregiver's intention is to maximize the empowerment of the child in preparation for their kind of
exactly.
transition into adulthood. Um, I could imagine that maybe, gosh, I'm not sure I know any immediate examples, but if there's maybe one of these organisms where the transition into being away from the caregiver is much earlier in life, is
Right,
there how does that change the plasticity empowerment
Right.
profile over time. It'd be really interesting to see that.
I mean, by the way, one of the things that's always struck me is, if you look at it from the neuroscience perspective, you get this phenomenon of early synaptic plasticity and early synaptic connection and then pruning. And you, again, like this is across many, many, many different organisms. You get this
Mm.
proliferation and then pruning. And yet, even though, neural net models are supposed to be based on neural nets, that's not a characteristic of the way that neural net models work. And again, the fact
Mhm.
that it's so ubiquitous suggests that there's some functional story about it. And it, again, just intuitively seems like the same kind of thing that you're talking about with the plasticity empowerment trade-off. So, a highly myelinated, uh, but you get an adult brain, it's got very efficient transfer, it's highly myelinated, but it's not very good at changing, it's not very good at plasticity. And then you sort of get the opposite in the early brain. Sorry.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And to be fair, we have not looked as much at, so for instance, my colleague Claire Lyle, who's on this work, has been leading this really cool line of work on the loss of plasticity in neural nets and inspecting why do they seem to lose plasticity in sort of inexplicable ways that maybe don't look anything like the way people lose plasticity. And we've talked just briefly about how might we connect this with some of that work, but we haven't really gone very far with it. But it'd be yeah, I'd be really curious to see what kind of explanatory power this notion of plasticity might have for better understanding these kinds of problems. Um, Amazing. Oh yeah, just a quick thought on the third point you mentioned of the empowerment
Yeah.
gain. I'll just kind of add my general support behind. I find empowerment gain feels really compelling as a signal for learning, for teaching. The example of maybe people get the kids getting bored and kind of moving on for other sources of empowerment gain it feels really compelling. Um, and my suspicion, just in the language of this simplex, is that all of that empowerment gain is probably happening in that bottom left uh, region. Meaning, let's see if I can pull up a cursor. I'm not sure how easily I'll be able to do this. Can you all see my cursor?
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay, this region down here,
Hmm.
meaning the empowerment gain doesn't come at the cost of any plasticity.
Oh.
Whereas I guess empowerment gain up here, if you or maybe here, in order to gain plasticity or empowerment, you'd have to lose plasticity. So maybe the only concrete thing I can mention is just my hunch would be when the empowerment is gained, it's happening safely in this region without any expense in plasticity.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm not sure. But yeah, thank you so much for the questions, Allison. Yeah, I love all three threads.
Yes.
Yeah,
Um,
any other questions? Yeah, Madonna.
yeah, thanks, Dave, for the great talk. I had a question regarding the bound on the plasticity and empowerment. So if plasticity and empowerment are mirror of each other, can we treat the asymmetry in their magnitudes as a signal for, learning the causal direction? Like, for example, if the information from observation to action, which is the empowerment. I always mix the distinction, but yeah, if the information from observation on the action is significantly higher than the information, the
Mhm.
directed information from action on the observation in a specific interval, does that imply that the agent is currently, affecting rather than causing in the substructure? And then so we can actually say the direction should be from X to Y versus Y to X. Like if there's asymmetry in their magnitude of the directed information.
Hmm. Interesting. So in the example of that plot I showed, we mentioned that the empowerment was quite a bit higher than the plasticity as an example. So something like that, if there's much higher empowerment than plasticity over an interval,
Mm-hmm.
then I think the question is like, what can we learn from that asymmetry?
Exactly.
From
Yeah.
understanding. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think in the abstract there are a few options because the setting is un unconstrained in a way. We can
Hmm.
imagine, for instance, something like this big world hypothesis, right? The world is orders of magnitude bigger than the agent and can just exert much more influence. If the agent is relatively small,
Hmm.
but say it has a really big aperture through which it views the world. So it has a really rich observation signal, but its
Right.
action space is very small.
Mm,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So maybe the actions are just bits. It emits in either 0 or 1, but its observation is this multimodal, three-dimensional,
mm,
interesting depth camera. The amount that the agent can change that world in a way that's observable is constrained to those bits.
mm,
Whereas
I
the
see.
amount, uh, but I guess at the same time, the amount that the environment can change the agent is also constrained because the observations, there's lots of information, but it's bottlenecked through
mm,
Okay.
the only way it can change the agent is through, well, you emit 0 or
Yes.
you emit 1.
Right.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so I'm just sort of thinking out loud about your question. I really like the question. I don't know if from these alone we can get to something like a causal structure
Mm.
would be my hunch, but it might tell us about like in this language is sort of the push and pull relationship between agent and environment, kind of which is doing more of the pushing effectively. And maybe that can tell us something about the comparative, say, capacity of each of the two systems. So
Right.
in say a setting where there were in fact like let's say equal capacity with action and observation,
Hmm.
so no longer bits on one side and rich
Right.
inputs on the other. Maybe in those cases, this asymmetry will tell us,
Mm.
yeah, something like a relative size between the two, or a relative capability of influence, or something of that sort.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So if, yeah, I think I need to think a bit more about this, but like if both the observations and actions have, the space is similar in terms of the amount of information that they can exchange, then that asymmetry can tell us maybe something about the direction um, of the influence, which yeah, is the direction of the influence the same as the direction of the causal edge?
mm, mhm,
That's a very good question.
mm,
I think there are some subtleties that pull these apart, to be honest, but they're very close. But I think there are some of these kind of
mm,
peculiar paradoxes of causality that show up here, where in the in the information, in the language of information, it's all just this communication game, and we make a pretty strong commitment with that conditioning. So with
Mm.
that, when we choose to condition on everything that comes before. I mentioned this
Mhm.
example of say X1 is a blue light, and that causes everything during X A to B and Y C to D to also be blue lights. Um, we're making a very specific commitment, which says there is no information flowing from X A to B to Y C to D. But we could cook up examples that say, well, a blue light means X A to B. X A is going to flip a coin. If it's blue, all of Y C to D will be blue. If
Mhm.
it's red, anyway, we can go into we can make
Yeah.
the examples very complex very quickly. But
Mhm.
there's some subtleties about causality that I don't think are quite captured fully by the GDI. Um,
Yeah.
and my colleague John Richens, who's on the project, who I think we've talked about John's work before, but he's been curious about a more explicitly causal story
mm.
um, of telling this kind of tension using that language, which I feel is an interesting direction too.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Dave.
Cool. Thanks, Monan. I appreciate it.
Could I also ask the causal question from a somewhat different perspective,
Mhm.
which speaks to the point earlier on that I guess Heidi was making about the and your last point about the knowledge, right?
Hmm.
So I'm thinking about how is this connected with something like a theory, right? Where what you've got is a causal representation of the environment. And, you've got classic ideas about DAGs and so forth that you're using to represent the causal direction of the environment. It feels like, I mean, on the one hand, it feels like creating a theory as a result of your observations is exactly an example of plasticity. On the other hand, it's obviously very deeply connected to ideas about empowerment if you have a kind of interventionist picture of causation. And you're going to be doing a whole bunch of interventions, aka experiments, to be able to update the theory. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that, how you think those two things. I've been tormented recently about trying to think about how you could get the whole formal apparatus of updating a causal model and then intervening related to this kind of picture about empowerment and plasticity. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks. I just a little bit. I would say my colleague John has been the one that has been thinking more deeply about this than I have.
Hmm.
But the picture that comes to mind for me is that we probably need something like that more, as you say, the more cognitive view of plasticity. So just to hop back a couple slides, this view that talks about how much of the experience is influencing things inside the agent's
Yeah.
mind,
Yeah.
that feels maybe critical for getting access to treating updates to that causal model as plasticity,
Hmm.
or at least updates that are stemming from experience.
Right, right, right.
Um, and the interventionist picture, we did, I would say, at least just briefly flesh out, is there a way to replace the randomness that's present in this
Right.
communication picture with like a more interventionist picture? So rather than think about, say, so with this definition of plasticity, I mentioned we can max over environments to get potential plasticity. And another version of that is to say, well, suppose we just have a space of interventions that you're allowed to make, or similarly with empowerment, a space of interventions you're allowed to make. And that can give you it's just a different language, of course, for writing down um, ways in which the agent can act. So in the language of
Mm-hmm.
GDI,
Mm-hmm.
the actions are random. So the agent just flips coins in its head, which is sort of a weak notion of intervention. It's the agent is creating information in the eyes of the environment. Um, so I do think there is a way, probably a way to flesh this out, and I would love to explore that. I don't have too much more than that though at this point, but I think I'd be especially curious to see, are there places where the fully causal story comes apart from this information language, or do they fully agree and kind of resonate with each other? I'm really not sure. But as a starting point, my hunch is we would need a fully fleshed out definition of this kind using this agent state or something like it, which just has some extra nuances to it.
Yeah, I want to build on this, the cognitive aspect. So, one thing I like about empowerment, or one of the many things I like about empowerment, is that it is an agent-centric definition, which means it has, it's not an objective fact about reality. It's just agents
Yeah.
perceive control in the future and so on. And in order to formalize that, just give it a mechanism, you have to give the agent an internal model that actually substantiates that kind of like subjective belief. And I
Mm.
think in that sense, the capacity of the agent's internal model should have some implications about its empowerment. Like if you have high capacity internal model, then you can absorb a lot of action conditioned informations, and it should kind of
Mm.
bound the empowerment somehow. But I mean, I don't know how it exactly works out, but I think that's to me that seems like an immediate next step to kind of like enrich this framework. So I wonder if you have thought about that.
Yeah, nice. Let's see. So yeah, a few thoughts. First is just to picking up on the very beginning piece about this kind of a subjective view of maybe probability or belief
Mhm.
that might be kind of implicit in the empowerment definition. That really resonates, and I do tend to think about the plasticity definition as also trying to embrace that perspective to some extent. So I used surprise at the beginning and I think it's fair to try to interpret this in a more objective way too, where these are just random coins in the world.
Mm.
But I think that the cleanest interpretation of this definition of plasticity is to say these are subjective beliefs. It's a subjective view of probability. There's things are being observed, and the agent is updating its internal state and then acting in response to what's observed. And so, in that sense, a deterministic environment is one where the agent has full conviction about the outcomes,
Hmm.
and so it just gives little room for variability, right? There's not even another possible observation that could have occurred. And in that sense, there isn't room for plasticity as well, because
Right.
there's only one observation that can occur.
Right.
Now, how it relates to, I guess, the agent having this internal causal model, I do, if I'm getting the point right, I would absolutely agree. I think we'd expect kind of richer internal causal models should yield higher empowerment in general because it allows the agent to maneuver through its environment more. We talked about the evolution of agency 2 weeks ago, and Tomasello has this view of these four kind of tiers of agency that roughly upgrade the extent of their causal model, and I think that does feel like a something like an empowerment ladder to some extent. Like how much can it reason about counterfactuals and reason about possible futures and steer the world in different ways. Um, so I think yeah, both your and Allison point really resonate, and I feel it's yeah probably in a really important direction to flesh out more, but I don't have too much to show for it at this point. But it'd be great to keep the conversation going and keep chatting.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier that some folks that you've talked to about this and about finding like one specific position on that optimal line in the simplex. Maybe like
Hmm.
different, internal models allow you to land on different parts or something. I don't know.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Right. If you have a perfect model, let's say, you might expect that to give you that would probably put you in the position of having maximal empowerment, but
And
no
then,
plasticity if you don't
yeah.
need to update your model anymore, right?
Right. Right.
Um, Interesting. Yeah, I like that. I like that framing, Hadi. That's nice because then you can imagine thinking about other cases like, the all models are wrong, some are useful. If we know we're in a setting where we can't have the right model, then we know we have to be in this region of uh, needing some plasticity effectively.
Yeah, I guess so. I just want to also connect this, the position on this landscape on the simplex to the earlier point about the big world hypothesis and the trade-off. I
Hmm.
wonder, and this is like pure speculation, but if you think about ecological, like ecology and like, the diversity of organisms that exist, and suppose we could somehow measure their plasticity and empowerment, because I think it's possible because you don't have to really measure it inside their brains. It's a behavior. Like carefully measure the observations and the ensuing behavior, and then somehow locate them on this simplex. I wonder if real organisms fall somewhere in between, and like we never have the edge cases that
Hmm.
you just mentioned earlier, like an organism that can perceive a lot but can only emit bits of information. That sounds like a highly improbable organism in biology. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, oh, that's such a cool question. Nice. Yeah, I I would say it does feel plausible, as you say, that there are regions of this empowerment plasticity simplex that are just uh, kind of don't contain biologically plausible organisms, that they're sort of maybe not pliable enough, or they're too fixated on kind of trying to steer the world. So, for instance, an agent that's um, near this maximally plastic and minimally empowered uh, region for its entire lifetime, you might expect that couldn't have, say, the level of biological fitness needed to
Mm.
survive and this sort of thing. So I like it as a potential kind of explanatory account of what sorts of organisms can thrive and flourish under different environmental configurations and constraints. And I love the question. I love the speculation. I I can't say I know too much about what any of that would look like, of course, but I think you're probably right that there are regions. And coming back to Allison's point, this kind of high plasticity, low empowerment, slow shift into high empowerment, low plasticity does feel like a really salient instance of this, maybe the most salient instance of this. But maybe identifying like other patterns of that kind could be, if any others exist,
Mm.
could be a compelling way to understand kind of the space of like effective decision making or effective learning. Maybe one thread we pulled on a little bit. I think we ended up putting this in like deep in the appendix that there's a just a very small result that says we can construct examples where agents have to have a certain level of plasticity to be optimal. And we can construct examples where agents have to have a certain level of empowerment to be optimal. And in thinking about the sort of temporal profile, I can imagine cases where maybe something needs to be true of the temporal profile, like this high plasticity into high empowerment transition for certain environments. You
Right.
can't have agents that are effective decision makers without that kind of profile. So I'd be excited about results like that, but that's the only one that we ended up showing, which is yeah, a very small one in like some bandit cases.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting, you know, I was saying there's this general pattern about having earlier plasticity, but in some, basically in kind of to be anthropomorphic stupid organisms like chickens, what you do see is in a way you see the reversal because you could see something like very constrained reflex like behavior early on, and then you have something like an associative mechanism that enables you to get to get more plasticity later. So it's not
Hmm.
crazy to think about an organism that is just starting out by just using these innate, just starts out using, some set of innate action patterns, and then later on in development is actually doing something like using associative learning to modify those. And it's interesting that like
Hmm.
to some extent, that's like, Chomsky or Liz Spelke's picture of what humans are like, which I think is it's fairly obviously wrong, but it's not like it's inconceivable that you could have, an organism that starts out being really highly constrained by some innate structure, which means that it's less plastic to begin with, and then,
Hmm.
it develops science or, some other elaborate cultural capacity later on that actually lets it be more plastic. I think it's interesting that that's not actually what's happening in the natural. That's not typically what's happening in the natural environment, and certainly not for things that are learning a lot. But this may be
Hmm.
completely crazy, but to some extent is like an LLM an example of something that's in the high plasticity, low empowerment environment. I mean, it's not really doing anything, right? But it's clearly
Hmm.
changing its structure depending on observation.
Right. In the sense that it's sort of context gets updated, and so it changes potentially quite a lot about what its
Right.
actions like. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's a question about how you define what its actions are. I guess if you thought about, but it's not reacting to its environment in some sense at all outside, forget about RLHF, right? It's
Hmm.
just pulling out the statistical structure of the observations. It's not actually using the output of its actions at all, right? It's not, it's, I don't know, this may be completely wrong, but it's struck me as being an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I haven't thought about this too much, to be honest. I tend to agree. I would say that it feels my immediate take would be likely to be best understood as highly plastic because how much the inputs can adjust
Right.
outputs. But I'm less sure about how to think about empowerment.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the people interacting with LLMs, I guess, can be influenced to potentially a great degree. So there is a way in which future inputs do depend heavily on the outputs of the LLM. So, but I'm less sure about that one.
Yeah, but I mean, in a way, right? Because it's pre-tuned, and then again, now forgetting about fine-tuning and RLHF, just the sort of base agent doesn't seem to be adapting or changing what it's doing. It's not doing reinforcement learning. It's not adapting or changing what it's doing based on what its outputs are. It's
Mm.
just doing it based on its observations.
Mhm.
Uh,
Right, right. Okay. So that's a nice reminder of one thing I wanted to mention, which is that I think that with this GDI, we can ask questions about the time scale of adaptation.
huh.
And with the with something like an LLM, we're mostly looking at how much did this very recent window of observations influence this very near term window of actions. But we could absolutely ask how much did the interaction from a week ago or a month ago or a year ago influence what happened later. And over those timescales, we wouldn't see, I think, any influence. And so it's a way of again just revealing maybe a characteristic of the system that over what timescale can they
Yeah.
respond to inputs.
By the way, we're almost running out of time, but this is so much fun. This is a really great discussion. You had this last line in your slide about goals and rewards.
Yeah.
Can we
Mm,
talk about that? Because so I
absolutely.
one thing I really appreciate about your way of doing this kind of work is that you're starting from really tight math and then you add these interpretations and words on top of it. But
Mm,
usually in cognitive science and psychology, we start from words
Mhm.
like goals and things like that, and then we try to make sense of them. And this has been a perennial issue, like goals and rewards. We come back to these. So I want to hear your thoughts about if this framework can be extended to capture goals as well.
yeah, thank you, Hadi. Yeah, thank you for the kind words too. Yeah, really appreciate that. I have a few seeds of ideas for this, but I'll admit right off the bat that we don't have anything that is fully fleshed out
Mhm.
to the point that it feels complete. So I think there's a few ways we could think about rewards in this mix. The first is effectively the either version of the story that we just briefly talked about here, where we can single out the reward as a special signal, and then we can ask questions about, say, we could call this quantity I'm showing here at the bottom, like the reward plasticity. How sensitive is the agent to changes in its reward? Now, that's really not what we ultimately care about when we talk about reward and goal-seeking behavior. We want to know, is this agent being influenced and doing influence in order to pursue its goals?
Right.
Is that influence sort of rational in a way? I'm a little reluctant to use rational. I think that brings on board a bunch of other considerations, but some notion of tethering the way in which this influence is happening. So, for instance, we can ask if the agent updates its beliefs in a way that we'd call plastic, so or it updates its causal model. We could ask, was that update ultimately in the service of its goals? Did it help further the agent's goals or not? And I think for getting there, we would need to bring on board the complete apparatus of goal seeking. So
Mhm.
rather than just talk about influence from say R to A, we probably wouldn't focus on how much reward influences the agent at all, but we might contrast, given that the agent updated its beliefs in this way, we can ask, of the different ways it could have updated its beliefs, which one sets the agent up to then maximize its rewards most effectively, or something of that form. So I think the rewards need to be exerting something like a normative pressure on the way in which the agent's being influenced and doing its influencing. Um, that would be my take about how we get there. But again, the pieces are scattered and I don't think yet fully form a full picture.
Let me, okay, so thanks for the explanation. Let me mention something even a little more radical, but it's not radical, but
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
actually going
please.
to build on something that Allison mentioned 2 weeks ago. Sometimes when we want to understand agency and agents, we rely too much on introspection. And we
Mm,
think that there are these things that are goals. It's totally possible that these goals are just post hoc rationalization of just things occur, and then we do
mhm,
things, and then we, in a post hoc manner, we just rationalize them. And this kind of also, this sentiment was captured in Yuri Bujaki's book about like brain from inside out. He's like, let's just let go of these like psychological terms and then look at the syntax of neural activity, and then like from that, just to build a model where like goals emerge rather than
Mm.
being defined and like as a starting point. So I wonder if there's a way to just extend these like information theoretic notions to define something that then when you implement it and let it run, then the consequence of that is something that we would call a goal. Like from inside out, like instead of just inducing a goal by having the agent like maximize a reward or something. What are your thoughts
Mm.
in that general, like, inverting the way of thinking?
Yeah, nice. I like that line of thinking a lot. One reaction I'd have to that, it reminds me of some of the kind of representation theorem results or things like unidentifiability in inverse RL, where
Mm,
every agent is consistent with many reward functions.
Hmm.
And so one worry you get with a view like this, where you kind of attribute intent or
yeah,
goals post hoc, is to say, well, whatever the agent's doing, I can always define the goal. There's a trivial goal, which is to emit exactly this action sequence
right,
that the agent just emitted.
right.
Um, and being able to eliminate that kind of explanation in
Mm,
favor of something that has maybe more genuine explanatory power feels
mm.
non-trivial, but important. There's probably ways to do it, but I don't see the immediate path to doing it. Um, but one other thing to say is that in the language of information,
Yeah.
I haven't seen versions of that kind of argument yet. So it could be that there's some kind of new mechanisms that are afforded in light of the fact that we're using this information theoretic language. Um, so, for instance, there's this paper by Amin, Zhang, and Singh, where they use intervention to reduce the space of reward functions that are consistent with a given agent. And they
Hmm.
show you can actually recover an equivalence class that's just, it's like the von Neumann Morgenstern kind of results, unique up to affine transforms that all explain that policy or agent perfectly. So you get rid of this problem of like the zero reward function. And
Mm,
so maybe with that kind of language here, we could ask, given that the agent's being influenced and influencing in this way, as you say, it's sort of inside out. If we have as experimenters can intervene in the world enough, we might be able to pinpoint this is what the agent is, this is the goal the agent is pursuing. This is what it's trying to do when it's updating in this way, when it's being influenced in this way, and when it's doing the influencing. So it's
I
maybe
mean,
like a more subjective take. Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
Alison, go
there's
for
an
it.
interesting question about, the agents you're describing here, right, are trying to increase empowerment, right? That's part of what they're doing. Now, it's natural. I mean, I've been thinking about this, like a natural thing to say is, well, let's use the structure of reward that you get in reinforcement learning, and now empowerment is just the reward. But in a way, what this suggests, which seems actually more plausible to me, is it kind of goes the other way around, that what the fundamental thing about the agent is increasing empowerment. And then the reward is something that later on, now you're deciding, okay, which one of these outcomes is actually going to be useful for me in this particular situation. I don't know if you've, so on your view, maximizing empowerment isn't quite going to be a goal or a reward. What do you think?
Hmm. Interesting. I think it absolutely could be. I know my honest take is that I tend to be quite soft in my commitment about what counts as the right sort of view about goals. And I
Yeah.
think of maximizing empowerment feels like one plausible one. And I think at least Tom was here maybe a couple weeks ago. He's argued in favor of the empowerment view as well. That um, yeah, I think you'll end up with, maybe I'd say it this way. You will likely end up with very different stories if you start from reward
Yes,
and then
exactly.
look at empowerment gain as opposed to starting from empowerment gain
Government
to
gain
get to reward.
yeah, exactly. That's
Uh,
my intuition as well. And I think that that makes a big difference between a sort of
hmm,
cognitive approach versus the kind of classic of a kind of classic RL, a classic RL approach. And again, it might depend a
yeah,
lot on how high dimensional your environment is about which strategy uh, an organism's gonna pursue. I mean, again,
totally.
babies look like they're not very, I mean, as I always say, they have one utility function, which is be as cute as you possibly can be. And they're very, very good at maximizing that utility function. And then basically they don't have to worry about any others, maybe find the source of milk, and then that's about it. But if you look at their empowerment, they're doing all of these activities. They're, putting tremendous calories into trying to maximize empowerment. And it's a question about, well, is it just that that's the cognitive? I mean, the way that people often describe this is, okay, you've got these intrinsic rewards or you've got these epistemic rewards. So it's just like RL, it's just like RL, except that it's got this tweak, which is that now you're using something like information value or information gain or empowerment as the reward. And in a way, I think it might be the other way around, that what happens is you are starting out by getting the range of ways that the organism can influence the environment. And then dependent on that, you have ideas about how you can actually do that to get reward. But I'm not sure. I think it's very interesting to think about.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that question. The ordering is, yeah, well, I'll definitely want to think about that
I mean, if you take that reward argument seriously, then you end up saying something like, the electron is orbiting the nucleus because it's more rewarding, and it's just meaningless.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is true that grown-ups are, in fact, doing things because they're going to get paid. But I think there are cases where you have organisms that are going after reward. But
Actually, so related to this, I want to advertise next week's talk, which is going to be the closing one for the March RL miniseries. I hope that you guys can join so we can continue the discussion, because it's a paper about the effective gradient hypothesis by Amitai Shenhav, who's a professor here at Berkeley.
yeah.
And he's arguing that, forget about goals. It's just we do things because ultimately we think they're going to make us feel good or avoid feeling bad. It's all about affect that drives all behavior. So I'm very curious to hear that presentation, and also if you guys have time to join the discussions. But yeah, I guess this is like the biggest unsolved problem to me as well. I mean, Dave, you mentioned free will, right? That's ultimately the question, right? Is there free will, or are we just things occur and then we just add, things occur because it makes us feel good? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, maybe we're 10 minutes past, so I don't know, if I don't want to keep people around, but that was the last thought.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely hope to make the talk next week. That sounds like a great session. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking through the long session and for all the wonderful, comments and questions and discussion. Yeah, this was a ton of fun. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you again, Hadi, for hosting and for having me as well.
Sure. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna stop recording and